There is a place in the Australian outback holding a scar older than complex life itself, older than bone, older than shell, older than any eye that could ever have watched it happen. If you stood directly on top of it today, you would see nothing at all. No crater wall rearing out of the scrub, no bowl pressed into the land, no ring of shattered stone marking where the world was once torn open. Just flat red earth, a few grazing sheep, mulga scrub, and silence stretching to the horizon in every direction. Cattle dust hangs in the heat, a windmill creaks somewhere out of sight. Nothing about this place looks like the scene of anything at all, let alone one of the most violent events in the deep history of our planet. For more than 2 billion years, this ground kept its secret so completely that geologists walked across it for decades without knowing what lay beneath their boots. Then, in 2020, a small team of scientists finally forced the Earth to confess. And the number they calculated didn't just rewrite a line in a textbook. It opened a question researchers are still arguing over today. Could this remote, invisible wound have once helped thaw an entire frozen planet? This is Yarrabubba. Somewhere between the outback towns of Sandstone and Meekatharra, on a working sheep station most people have never heard of, sits the oldest confirmed meteorite impact structure on the face of the Earth, dated to 2.229 billion years old. It is so ancient that it predates shells, bones, and backbones anywhere on the planet. It is so ancient that when it happened, the air itself was only just beginning to fill with the oxygen we now breathe without thinking. And until very recently, science had no way to prove any of this was even true. To understand how something this violent could vanish so completely, we have to go back. Not centuries, not millennia, billions of years. If you're new here, welcome. This channel exists to dig into the geological mysteries and deep time secrets written into the Australian landscape stories carved in stone long before anyone thought to write anything down. If that's the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy falling into, consider subscribing, because we publish new investigations like this one regularly. Now back to the outback, and to a crater that, by every normal rule of erosion, should have been completely unprovable. To find Yarrabubba, you first have to find the Yilgarn Craton, one of the oldest, most stable slabs of continental crust left on the surface of our planet. Some of the granite and greenstone that make up this ancient shield date back more than 3 billion years, making it some of the oldest solid ground anywhere on Earth. To put that in perspective, for roughly 2/3 of Earth's entire history, this exact patch of crust has already existed in something close to its current form old, before most of the planet's other land masses had even finished forming. It stretches across the interior of Western Australia as a vast, sun-hardened plateau of red soil. Salt lakes and low breakaway hills, shaped slowly by wind and the rare violent rains that follow a passing cyclone. Out here, the vegetation is mulga scrub and hummocks of spinifex grass, tough enough to survive months, sometimes years, without meaningful rain. This is gold country too. The Murchison goldfields drew prospectors in the 1890s. And small mining operations still work the ground not far from here. Between the tiny outback settlements of Sandstone and Meekatharra sits Yarrabubba Station, a remote pastoral lease that gave the crater its name. Days out here can swing from bitter pre-dawn cold to blistering, shimmering heat by mid-afternoon, and the nearest town of any size might be hours away by dirt road. It is, in almost every sense, the kind of landscape people call the middle of nowhere. By any visual measure, it is unremarkable. Flat, quiet, the kind of place you could drive straight through and never once suspect what happened here. That's because there is no crater left to see. Over 2 billion years of wind, rain, and continental drift have worn away everything an untrained eye would recognise as an impact site: the raised rim, the surrounding blanket of ejected debris, even the bowl-shaped depression itself. All of it is gone, eroded down to nothing. So how do you find an invisible crater? You look underground. Aeromagnetic surveys instruments flown in low grids across the landscape. Reading tiny disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field picked up something strange. A vast, smooth, roughly circular zone where the normal magnetic signature of the rock had been wiped clean. At the centre of that anomaly sits a modest, unremarkable hill of pale rock called Barlangi Rock. Barlangi Rock is what geologists call a central uplift, the place where, in the instant after a major impact, the crushed and molten floor of the crater rebounds upward, like the splash that follows a stone dropped into water, then freezes in place. In a large enough impact, the initial crater is often too deep and too steep to stay stable. Within moments, the shattered rock beneath the point of impact rebounds violently upward, overshoots equilibrium, then collapses back down into a lower, wider, saucer-shaped basin, leaving a raised dome of intensely shocked rock sitting at the very centre. That central dome is often the last piece of an ancient crater still standing, long after wind and rain have worn everything else flat. At Yarrabubba, it's the only piece left at all. Scientists studying the rock found the unmistakable fingerprints of a hypervelocity impact, shatter cones. Distinctive upward branching fracture patterns that form only under the extreme, near instantaneous pressures of a cosmic collision, microscopic planar deformation features sliced clean through individual quartz crystals, and pseudotachyllite, a glassy rock produced when solid stone is instantly melted by friction and shock. None of these form through ordinary volcanic or tectonic processes. Volcanoes can melt rock, earthquakes can fracture it, but nothing on Earth, short of a nuclear detonation, generates the specific pressures needed to bend a quartz crystal's internal lattice into the razor-thin, perfectly parallel planes geologists found here. To create features like that, you need a strike from space. They are the geological equivalent of a fingerprint left at a crime scene. Based on the size of that buried central uplift, researchers estimate the original crater once stretched roughly 70 kilometres across a scar large enough to swallow a small city picture, that entire footprint stamped into the ground in a single instant, and then picture nearly all of it quietly sanded away, now reduced to a faint ripple in the Earth's magnetic field, hiding quietly beneath sheep pasture and spinifex. Long before any instrument could read the magnetism buried in this ground, this land was already known, walked, and cared for. The Murchison region is Wajarri Yamaji country, and the Wajarri people have held a continuous connection to it for tens of thousands of years, generations upon generations, who have watched the seasons turn across this same red country, one of the longest unbroken relationships between any people and any landscape on Earth. Their knowledge of this country has been carried forward through generations, through language, ceremony and law, passed from elders to children with a precision Western science is only beginning to properly appreciate. The Wajarri language itself, painstakingly preserved and recorded by community elders, is counted among the oldest continuously spoken languages in the world. Its vocabulary rebuilt and safeguarded across more than 2 decades of dedicated work by Wajarri families determined that it would still be spoken by their grandchildren. Elsewhere on this same country, Wajarri knowledge of the night sky runs so deep that the Wajarri Yamaji are today the recognised custodians of one of the most sensitive radio astronomy sites on the planet, a living tradition of watching the heavens that long predates any telescope. That recognition sits alongside a formal native title determination, covering close to 90,000 square kilometres of the Murchison and Gascoyne, achieved in 2020, after a process the Wajarri Yamaji had pursued since 1995, a quarter century of documentation, negotiation and persistence to have their continuous connection to this country formally acknowledged in Australian law. 4 Wajarri land groups share custodianship across that vast area, each represented by its own committee of elders and traditional owners. And yet, when it comes to Yarrabubba itself, there is no ancient story of a falling star, no dreaming account of a great scar torn into the earth. That absence isn't a gap in Wajarri knowledge. It's a clue in its own right. Compare Yarrabubba to Wolfe Creek Crater, roughly the width of 10 football fields, sitting far to the north in the Tanami Desert. Wolfe Creek is young by comparison, barely 120,000 years old, and its bowl-shaped scar is still dramatically, unmistakably visible from the ground. The Jaru and Walmajari people who have lived around it call it Kandi Malal, and they carry genuine, well-documented dreaming stories about how it formed. One tells of 2 rainbow serpents crossing the desert, one plunging into the earth to leave the crater behind, another, recorded from an elder whose knowledge stretched back before European contact, describes the evening star passing too close to the moon, falling to earth in fire and thunder, and terrifying the people until they finally dared approach what it had left behind. Remarkably, that oral account closely mirrors the actual scientific explanation for how the crater formed. Jaru elders also describe sinkholes at the centre of the crater, and unusually large trees growing, where water collects after rain practical. Observed knowledge of the landscape woven into the very same stories that explain its origin. The crater and its stories are still carried today in Jaru art, song and ceremony. Yarrabubba never offered that kind of warning, because by the time the first humans walked this continent, there was nothing left to see. The crater had already vanished from the surface world for well over 2 billion years ancient, even to the oldest continuous culture on Earth. But one detail does connect Yarrabubba's deep past to the people who have lived here, far more directly than any myth could. Barlangi Rock, the very heart of the buried crater, the melted, shock-shattered stone forced up from the depths of the impact itself, was quarried by Aboriginal toolmakers, its fine, glassy grain chipped and shaped into blades and cutting tools. Generation after generation stood on the healed root of one of the most violent events in this planet's ancient history, working that stone with their hands, never knowing they were shaping the scar of an asteroid 2 billion years dead. It's worth sitting with that image for a moment. Hands shaping tools from stone that had in truth been forged in a moment of planetary catastrophe, the ordinary, patient work of daily survival, carried out unknowingly on top of one of the most extraordinary events in the story of the Earth. If Yarrabubba has no ghost stories, it does have a case file, a genuine, decades-long chain of buried clues and scientific stubbornness that reads, in its own way, like a mystery all its own. The story starts quietly in the late 1800s and into the 1890s, when the Murchison Gold rush-pulled prospectors and pastoralists deep into this stretch of Western Australia. Sheep stations like Yarrabubba were staked out across a landscape people assumed they understood completely hard, dry, ancient, but explainable. For nearly a century, nobody suspected there was anything unusual about this particular patch of ground. The first real clue surfaced almost by accident in 1979, when a field geologist working for the Geological Survey of Western Australia collected a routine granite sample during regional mapping. Sliced thin and examined under a microscope back in the lab, that sample showed strange twisted deformation patterns in its crystal structure, the kind of damage that shouldn't occur in ordinary granite. At the time, no one connected it to anything unusual. The sample was catalogued and for more than 20 years essentially forgotten. This is how a surprising number of scientific breakthroughs actually happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone to notice that an old, ordinary-looking piece of evidence means something extraordinary. The next clue came from the sky. In 2001, aeromagnetic survey data processed at Geoscience Australia revealed something nobody standing on the ground could ever have noticed: a huge, smooth, roughly circular zone where the Earth's magnetic signature had been wiped strangely flat, centred on that same unremarkable hill of pale rock. That anomaly was enough to send geologists back into the field. In 2003, researcher Francis MacDonald and colleagues published the first formal study confirming what the magnetism had hinted at. This was an impact structure. They found shatter cones. They found shock-fractured quartz. They found pseudo-tachyllite glass, frozen mid-melt. They named the structure Yarrabubba, after the station whose fence lines happened to cross directly over its buried heart. It was painstaking work, driving cross-country between outcrops, hammering samples from sun-baked granite, cutting them into wafer-thin slices, and searching those slices under a microscope for fractures too fine to see with the naked eye. But they could not say how old it was, without a reliable way to date the shock-damaged minerals precisely. Early estimates for Yarrabubba's age swung wildly anywhere between 1.1 billion and 2.6 billion years. A margin of error spanning 1.5 billion years isn't a scientific answer. It's an open case. For 17 years, Yarrabubba sat in scientific limbo, confirmed as an impact site, but with no way to say whether it belonged to a relatively recent chapter of Earth's history, or to a chapter so old it predated almost everything else we thought we understood about the ancient planet. That case stayed open for the better part of 2 decades, until a team led by geochronologist Timmins Eriksson, working with Curtin University and NASA's Johnson Space Center, returned to Barlangi Rock with a sharper set of tools. They targeted 2 specific minerals, zircon and monazite, that behave almost like tiny atomic stopwatches. When these crystals are struck by the extreme pressure of a hypervelocity impact, their internal clocks reset to 0. By measuring the slow, steady decay of uranium into lead inside these microscopic grains, the team could calculate, with startling precision, the exact moment that reset occurred. Uranium decays into lead at a rate so constant, so utterly indifferent to heat, pressure, or chemistry, that it functions as one of the most reliable clocks in all of science. Zircon and monazite crystals lock uranium in when they form, while excluding lead almost entirely, so nearly all the lead found decades or billions of years later can only have come from radioactive decay. When shock from an impact resets that internal structure, it restarts the clock. Read the ratio of uranium to lead in the right way, and you're not measuring when the mineral was first born. You're measuring the instant it was reborn, in fire, 2 billion years ago. The answer, published in January 2020, 2.229 billion years ago, with a margin of error of just 5 million years, a rounding error in geological terms. Yarrabubba was no longer just old. It was, officially, the oldest confirmed meteorite impact structure ever found on Earth, surpassing South Africa's Vredefort dome by more than 200 million years, and Canada's Sudbury Basin by nearly 400 million. A secret buried for 2 billion years, cracked open at last by a crystal smaller than a grain of sand. If part of you is still waiting for this story to turn toward the supernatural strange lights, unexplained disappearances, something buried out there that science refuses to touch, you can stop waiting. Because what researchers found when they finally dated this crater is stranger and bigger than any campfire story. It suggests this single impact may have helped drag the entire planet out of a deep freeze that gripped it for longer than almost anything else in Earth's history. Subscribe now, because we're about to get into exactly how. Here's something unusual about Yarrabubba. It never really generated a public mythology. There's no thriving corner of the internet insisting it's an alien landing site, no Bermuda Triangle of the Outback reputation, no ghost hunting crews driving out to sandstone with MFEF meters. The reason is almost disappointingly simple. You cannot build a legend around something nobody can see. No visible crater means no photograph to fuel speculation, no dramatic sinkhole for a documentary crew to stand inside. Yarrabubba's mystery was never spiritual or supernatural. From the very beginning, it was a purely scientific whodunit, argued out in journals rather than online forums. That doesn't mean there was no uncertainty to clear up. Before 2003, that strange circular magnetic anomaly beneath the Murchison Scrub was a genuine open question. In principle, it could have been almost anything: a buried volcanic intrusion, some ancient tectonic scar, an ordinary quirk of deeply buried rock. Circular magnetic anomalies like this show up more often than you'd think in old, deeply eroded terrain, and most of them turn out to be nothing extraordinary: buried granite domes, ancient faults, mineral deposits with no cosmic origin at all. Ruling out every other explanation required physical proof, not speculation, which is exactly what shatter cones, shock-fractured quartz, and pseudo-tachyllite provided, signatures that form only under the specific. Extreme pressures of a hypervelocity impact are nowhere else in nature. Once those features were confirmed under the microscope, the impact origin of Yarrabubba stopped being a hypothesis and became established fact. It's a useful reminder of how real scientific mysteries usually get solved, not by chasing the most dramatic explanation, but by patiently eliminating every mundane one first. The real debate, the one still playing out in scientific literature today, is about consequences, not causes. Researchers noticed something striking when they finally pinned down Yarrabubba's exact age. It lines up within the margin of error with the tail end of the Huronian glaciation, widely considered the longest ice age our planet has ever experienced. Specifically, Yarrabubba's age matches, almost precisely, the dated age of the Rietfontein diamictite in South Africa sediment, laid down by the very last glaciers of that ancient ice age on the opposite side of the planet. Two continents, thousands of kilometres apart today, both preserving a record of the exact same geological moment. That timing led some researchers to a genuinely startling hypothesis. Computer simulations suggest that an impactor several kilometres wide, striking a continental ice sheet roughly 2 kilometres thick, could flash vaporise an almost unimaginable volume of ice, instantly injecting a colossal quantity of water vapour into the atmosphere. By some estimates, that single impact could have released somewhere between roughly 87 trillion and 5 quadrillion kilograms of water vapour into the sky within moments, not gradually, the way ordinary evaporation works, but essentially all at once. Water vapour is itself a powerful greenhouse gas, released suddenly and in sufficient quantity. It could theoretically help trigger a warming spike strong enough to assist in breaking a planet-wide glaciation. Not every scientist is convinced. Skeptics point to simple scale. At roughly 70 kilometres across, Yarrabubba is well under half the width of the Chicxulub crater in Mexico, the impact blamed for ending the age of the dinosaurs 6 million years ago, at somewhere around 180 kilometres across. If Chicxulub could darken skies worldwide for years, skeptics ask, could a crater under half that size really have shifted the climate of an entire planet on its own, or did it simply arrive at a moment when the planet was already teetering toward a thaw anyway? The debate remains unresolved, which means that right now, working scientists are still genuinely arguing about whether a hole in the ground outside Meekatharra once helped end the coldest, longest chapter in the story of our planet. Strip away the ambiguity, and what's left at Yarrabubba is not a curse, a monster, or a haunting. It's something quieter, and in its own way, far more unsettling, a demonstration of just how easily even planetary-scale violence can be erased. Picture the moment itself, reconstructed not from myth, but from physics. An object several kilometres across, travelling many times faster than a rifle bullet, slams into an ice-covered landscape of ancient granite. In a fraction of a second, rock and ice alike are vaporised at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. A fireball briefly outshines the sky. A shockwave radiates outward, flattening and pulverising everything for tens of kilometres in every direction, while the ground itself briefly behaves like a liquid rebounding upward at the centre to form the very hill, Barlangi Rock, that still stands there today. For a radius of many kilometres around the point of impact, solid granite would have briefly moved and flowed like water, before locking back into stone as the shockwave passed and the temperature fell. If the ice sheet hypothesis holds, an almost incomprehensible mass of water vapour is hurled into the atmosphere within moments, setting off a slow-motion climate shift that could take thousands of years to fully play out. And then nothing. No dinosaurs to go extinct, no forests to burn. At this point in Earth's history, the most complex life in existence was microbial, simple cells drifting in shallow seas, in an atmosphere only just beginning to accumulate the free oxygen that would, eventually, make animal life possible at all. There was no one to see it happen, no one to be afraid. There is something genuinely strange in that, an event this violent, occurring on an empty stage, with no witness of any kind, human, animal, or otherwise, anywhere on the planet to register that anything had happened at all. Just an ancient planet absorbing a wound of almost unimaginable scale. And then, given enough time, quietly closing back over it. That's the real terror hiding inside this story, not a monster in the dark, but the sheer indifference of deep time. An event powerful enough to potentially help thaw an entire planet has been ground down, buried, and erased so completely that it took the most sensitive isotope dating instruments on Earth, reading the internal structure of individual crystals barely visible to the naked eye, just to prove it happened at all. Everything above the current ground surfaced the crater's rim. Its walls, its entire upper structure, has simply been sanded away by 2 billion years of wind and rain, grain by grain, until only the deepest, most stubborn root of the impact remained to be found. If something this large can vanish without a trace, it puts a very different scale on everything else, every landscape, every quiet paddock, every unremarkable hill that might be hiding a chapter of the planet's history we haven't yet learned to read. Yarrabubba asks us to reconsider what a monument actually is. We tend to picture monuments as things built to be seen towers, standing stones, structures reaching for the sky. But arguably the oldest monument on this continent was built to disappear. A wound so old it healed itself into total invisibility, hidden from every eye, indigenous and scientific alike, until nuclear physics finally learned to read the memory locked inside a single grain of zircon. There's something almost comforting in that. It means the Earth forgets nothing, even the things it hides so well that we need billion-dollar instruments just to prove they happened. It means that somewhere beneath your own feet, right now, there might be a chapter just as old, just as violent, and just as astonishing, quietly waiting for someone patient and precise enough to finally ask the ground the right question. What do you think should more of the world's silent, unremarkable places be investigated this closely? Let us know in the comments below, and if this journey into deep time was worth your while, subscribe for more stories written in stone.